So, how do nations grow in the long run? Well, there's several different types of growth we could talk about, but Solo identified two main types, and these are the ones we're going to focus on. Now, poor countries have what's called catching up growth. They start out below the steady state and they work to catch up. And this would be the same as your capital accumulation. And this catching up growth, like I said, is fast, but it has to stop eventually because eventually you catch up and there is no catching up left to do. Eventually you hit the steady state and your investments and your depreciation equal each other and you stop. You could also say that poor countries have catching up growth because they're poor by virtue of having not already hit the steady state. Now, the other type of growth is what Solo calls cutting edge growth, and it's what the rich countries do, what the first world does. They invent new technologies, increasing output at all capital levels. And this is slow, but it doesn't stop. It can continue and continue and continue forever. Now, I'll draw you a little figure here to illustrate the idea. Let's just draw the one curve for investment. In catching up growth, that's like a market equilibrating. You start out below the steady state level of capital, and you just accumulate capital through your own savings until you get there. And you see how the gap shrinks. So you slow down as you get closer. But you will get there. Cutting edge growth is more like a shock. In cutting edge growth, something happens that either something happens to make your existing capital more productive, like you discover a new technique, or you pass new regulations, or you remove regulations. Something changes that either makes your existing capital better, or it creates an entirely new type of capital so that for the same dollar of investment, you can get more output. But either way, the steady state has moved. The output per worker goes up. And the steady state itself shifts. It shifts from A all the way up to B. Cutting edge growth implies catching up growth because you have to catch up to the new steady state, but it's different in the sense that your capital stock didn't artificially fall. Instead, your capabilities outgrew your capital stock. There are new inventions, new technologies, new ways of producing that make it possible for you to squeeze more output out of the same level of investment. And so suddenly, you're able to start accumulating again as you change the mix of your investments to reflect the new reality. And this is why it's no miracle that economic miracles happen. See, people have this habit. They see that some country is growing like crazy. It is growing extremely fast. And that quick growth leads people to, especially the biggest power, right? Whoever's currently top dog in the world, like we are, they will get a little nervous about it because they think this other country is coming to steal their thunder, and they don't understand why they're growing so quickly. It leads to a lot of soul searching. Are we doing something wrong? This nation is achieving double-digit GDP per capita growth rates, and we're down at like 3%. But as Solo explained, it's not that these countries are just remarkable. It's not that they're better at production or better at economics. It's that they have more ability to save because they're so poor. You wreck a place, you either wreck it through natural disasters or through war or through bad policies. The rulers of the land govern it poorly and they wreck it. But you wreck a place, and as long as you leave the people's abilities, the people's training, the people's knowledge intact, they will be able to rebuild. We saw this in a very dramatic fashion with the end of World War II. Germany and Japan were destroyed. They were both destroyed. The cities were gone. A huge chunk of their populations were gone. And yet, they managed to regrow in a matter of decades and become rich nations once again, to reclaim the same place they used to have. And it stunned people. In the case of Japan, it especially stunned them because they actually become much richer than they were before the war. And if you ever go back and watch a lot of like 1980s era movies, you see this theme, especially in cyberpunk. They tend to portray a future that's dominated by the Japanese. It was the same as China is now. Now, China's actually kind of hit their steady state recently. So this theme, it might disappear in the near future. But especially when I was growing up, there was always this almost hysteria coming from conservatives that China was going to overtake us. China was going to be the great power. They made a huge deal out of how China finally had a larger economy than the US a few years back. And the thing is, the bigger China got, the slower its growth started to get until finally it just sort of fizzled out. Well, if people had remembered, right, your average American has no memory at all. They forget things that happened more than a few years ago. Goldfish. You live in a nation of goldfish. Well, if people had remembered, they would have said, hey, didn't we see this movie already? Didn't we see it with Japan? Because there was a lot of anxiety back in the day that Japan was going to overtake us, become the #1 power on Earth, and, we would be sidelined. Japan spends the whole war getting firebombed into oblivion by the US Air Force. They get starved to death by the US Navy. They get nuked twice just to make a point by the US Air Force. And yet they rise back because the things that they lost were only things. And the people that they lost had a huge personal cost. But in the long term, from the perspective of history, people too can be replaced. What can't be replaced is technical know-how. But the Japanese managed to preserve their technical know-how. They still kept engineers. They still kept scientists. They still kept the thinkers who were able to create new inventions and able to show people how to make machines and to be able to teach the next generation to do it too. And so when they wander out of World War II, dirt poor, they were primed for an explosion of growth because they already knew how to build a modern economy. They just had to get to work. And with no capital to maintain, with no, with no physical structures hardly left in their major cities, they could focus everything on building new stuff. And every little bit they had made a big difference. This can also come up with a country being backwards, right? It can come up with a country being there just aren't people there, or they have a bad government. In this graph down here, it compares the case of Cuba, a communist nation, and Singapore, the most capitalist society on earth. Now, I will tell you this, the big theme of this topic is that capitalism and democracy go together like a hand in a glove, but Singapore is not a democracy. I'm admitting that to you for honesty. But Singapore in 1950 is just a little town at the edge of a swamp. It's shanties. Singapore is a young city. Same with Hong Kong. Hong Kong was built by the British. It's not a Chinese city by origin. The British, they invaded, they conquered the rock that it sits on, but they built the city themselves. 50 years ago, this city is a shanty town. Today, it is one of the richest societies on earth, one of the most prosperous societies on earth, one of the most civilized. Cuba, on the other hand, was a glittering place in the 50s. Now it suffered greatly from a great degree of income inequality, which would lead to its revolution. But Cuba in the 50s was like Las Vegas now. It's where it was like Las Vegas and Miami and New Orleans combined. Americans would go down there to party. It had a big cabaret scene. It had a big gambling scene. The mafia basically had this deal set up with the Cuban government. They were allowed to run Havana like it was their own town. And there was a ton of wealth flowing into the nation. And then they go communist. And then the economic calculation problem rears its ugly head. And all of this wealth that the spontaneous order of capitalism created evaporated, and you're left with a typical poor banana republic now. If you were to look at the living standard at the same time between these two cities, but you didn't know anything else about them, you would expect Havana to have become the rich one, Havana to have become the envy of the world, and Singapore to remain a joke. There's another story I have of Spain. In America, we like to make this big deal out of saving the world from fascism, but the only fascists we went after were fascists that tangled with other countries. Spain was a fascist power, but they had the good sense not to invade their neighbors, so they got let off scot-free. U.S. Army didn't go in to invade them. Well, after the war, Spain gets punished for having been friendly to Hitler. The dictator who ran the place, Francisco Franco, he liked the idea of autarky anyways, not trading with other countries. And we weren't willing to trade with him even if he did want to. And so for the next 2 decades, the place just rots. They were already trashed by their own civil war. But unlike places like Japan that boom after World War II, Spain doesn't boom. Spain stagnates. They don't rebuild. By the late 50s, they're still on the verge of starvation, even after a decade of potential growth. And the reason is that they have a fascist government. They have a government that goes around and tells everyone how they're going to run their business, how much they're going to sell a specific good for, what kinds of goods they're going to make, and they won't accept help from anybody else. We're going to make all of our own stuff. Everything's going to be made in Spain, regardless of if we could get it cheaper from elsewhere. They don't get to specialize in the things that they're good at. And by the 70s, the country is so poor that it's on the verge of collapse. And Franco finally gives up. He finally admits, and this is remarkable. It's always remarkable when a despot does this. He had ruined the place, but he had the honesty and the character to say, you know, I'm not fit to run this country anymore. And he turns control of the government over to a group of Catholic economists called Opus Dei. It was a lay organization. And he hands the reins of government off to them and tells them, it's up to you now. Fix the country in whatever way you can. And what they do is they implement liberalization. They implement capitalism. They implement free trade. They start inviting the West back to their country. And Spain decides to totally remake its identity. Instead of trying to go it alone in this world, Spain invites in tourists. That's their big thing. British people go to Spain for vacation like Americans go to the Caribbean or to Cancun or Florida. But as soon as it starts, as soon as Franco steps out of the way, the place starts to flourish practically overnight. Now, Spain's not a rich country by European standards, but it's a rich country by global standards. The change can happen very quickly, and there's nothing miraculous about it. It's predicted in the model. If you allow people to trade with each other, if you allow people to go about their business, they can rebuild from the worst of disasters. They can do so under their own direction. Now, for ages, because of that idea that poor countries grow faster, for ages, economists predicted what we call convergence. Everyone's going to get equally wealthy in the long run. And yet what we found did not exactly support that story. Many parts of the world stagnated. They just didn't change. Some parts of the world even backslid. Africa is in worse shape now than it was when colonization ended. And people would blame history. They would say, colonialism did this to us. In Eastern Europe, they'd say communism did this to us. In the American South, they would say that both slavery and Reconstruction did this to us. I don't think I went into detail on that. In the South, the North basically colonized the South after the Civil War. The radical Reconstruction governments they forced on the South more or less plundered the South. So the place was already jacked up from slavery, and then it gets jacked up even worse by Lincoln's, successors. Well, we can blame history, but how can history affect a nation now? Why would the past matter today? And where does this cutting-edge growth come from? We understand accumulation of capital, but what makes one country better at inventing things than another? What makes one country very productive? Just look at China, for example. China led the world in inventions back in its day. Iraq, Baghdad led the world in inventions back in its day. Granted, the pace of invention itself was a lot slower back then, but relatively speaking, these were the advanced parts of the world. These were the places where science flourished, and yet that's not true anymore. How did those savage backwards Europeans and frontier pioneer Americans manage to pull ahead? Well, the secret is going to come from combining the work of Schumpeter on creative destruction with the work of Acemoglu. with his extractive and inclusive institutions. But before we can get into that, you're going to need some basic public choice background. Now, for this, I've just gone ahead and put like the original video in the playlist. But when you watch it, I want you to really focus on it and really get the basic concepts. Watch it twice if you have to. Because CGP Grey makes a far more elegant argument than I ever could. He does a bang-up job of explaining this idea that you can have, firstly, that the political system and the economic system affect each other, but also that history has its own momentum. But I'll see you after you're done with that.